Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this next session in our Freedom Association Conquer Cancel Culture Conference. And this session is entitled, Should There Be Any Limits on Free Speech and Free Expression? And if so, what should they be? I'm delighted to be joined on my right, although not necessarily politically, by Tom Slater and Lembit Opik, who we've already heard from. I'm Tim Scott, I'm the Treasurer. I'm the one who has to sign the cheques. So thank you all for your continued support for the Freedom Association. And if you go to tfa.net and you go top right, you can find out more about our Patrons Club. We will be having a Patrons Club reception afterwards. So to our panel, I won't reintroduce Lembit, who we've already heard from. Tom Slater is the editor of Spiked Online, that's spiked-online.com. He's recently written in support of Israel with the Hamas attacks and against Rishi Sunak's proposed extended smoking ban, saying that it marks a depressing triumph of the nags and the killjoys. And he, as Thomas pointed out, this raises the prospect of a 45-year-old in future years hanging around outside the local corner shop saying to a 46-year-old, "Hey, mister, can you go inside and buy me some cigarettes?" I fear that's where we will end up with. So let's get straight into the session. We are a bit pushed for time, I'm afraid. So let's crack on with it. And Tom, let's start with you, as we've already heard from Lembit. What are? No, don't worry. Don't worry. We'll get you in, Lembit. Don't worry. Tom, what are the limits of free speech, do you think?
Well, I think this is a really important question, and thanks for asking me to come and talk about it, just because I do feel like we've been playing the free speech debate kind of on easy mode for the last couple of years, just because of how crazy things have got. We're in the often quite comfortable position of only having to defend people who actually have relatively respectable opinions. Such is the age that we live in. The great heresy is to suggest that there are two biological sexes. Such is the age that we live in. You have university academics, people like Neil Thin at the University of Edinburgh, who got suspended for opposing racially segregated university events, for opposing them. And of course, we live in an age in which to criticise and to mock gods and prophets, or if we're being honest, one specific god and one specific prophet, is punching down and can get you menaced for doing that, even though, as my friend Andrew Doyle likes to say, you really can't punch much higher than heaven. But this is such an important issue, is that we need to really get down to brass tacks, because of the fact that our commitment to freedom of speech is really based on our willingness to uphold it in all circumstances. And for me, therefore, freedom of speech is, in essence, has no limits. I think we need, the test for freedom of speech is very much one about sticking up for those that we most virulently hate. I think Noam Chomsky, who I doubt will be quoted favourably for the rest of this conference here today, put it very well, which is that freedom of speech is the freedom for those we despise. And I really think that is the test. And therefore, with that in mind, I think it's important that whilst we might be accustomed to sticking up for respectable people, we need to really steel ourselves for sticking up for the deeply unrespectable people, for people whose views we hate, for people who hate us in return. And I think what that means is making clear that when we talk about freedom of speech having limits, the only limits we're talking about is when speech ceases to be speech and becomes something else. So when you incite violence, when you defraud someone, when you lie on a tax return, those are not speech crimes, those are crimes that involve speech. And I think that's something that we should make abundantly clear. And any attempt to encroach upon freedom of speech beyond that is something that we really shouldn't tolerate. And I think the urgency of this is really important. First of all, because, and I'm sure many of you have heard this point before, it's been articulated by many brilliant free speech defenders over history. If you do not guard even your enemy from censorship, you create a mechanism that will eventually reach you. That's something that's been said time again. Ira Glasser, former head of the American Civil Liberties Union, a great hero of mine, had a great analogy for it. He said speech restrictions are like poison gas. They seem like a great idea when you've got your enemy in your sights, but then the wind changes direction. And I think that's something we've got to bear completely in mind. But I think there's a secondary reason why it's so important today, which is that the people that we're up against don't just want to introduce kind of neat, specific restrictions, caveats, carve-outs for freedom of speech. They're rubbishing the idea in total. So if we're talking about Islamists, if we're talking about extreme identitarians, they don't just think that freedom of speech has gone a bit too far and it needs to be hemmed in. They reject the concept entirely. They see it as a kind of Western colonialist myth, that it's just there to amplify the voices of the oppressors and put the boot on the neck of the oppressed, effectively. So I think every time that we concede the principle, we fuel their narrative, which is that when people stick up for freedom of speech, they don't really mean it. That it's basically just a way of protecting them and their friends and people who look like them. So I think there's a doubly important reason why we need to stick up for freedom of speech today. For me, the main battleground, therefore, is that we really need to make abundantly clear and be unabashed in saying that hate speech is free speech, as difficult as that is to swallow sometimes. That sticking up for free speech means sticking up for the genuinely extreme, offensive, hateful, and that it is a profound moral error to think that you can challenge bigotry through censorship. I think that's something that we've got to make clear all the more these days. And with the recognition that this is about our ability to be able to take, say, the disgusting anti-Semitism that we've seen spilling out onto Britain's streets in recent weeks after the pogrom in Israel, and say we want to know who those people are, we want to know what they think, precisely so we can challenge them. And that's really important. So, in sum, we need to stick up for freedom of speech with no ifs and no buts. We need to reject the kind of framing that free speech has limits. We need to make sure that hate speech, make clear to people that hate speech is free speech, and there's a reason for that. And also we need to, get off easy mode effectively and start having some hard arguments again, I think.
Good. Thank you, Tom.
Right, this doesn't take long, but it summarises what I want to say. Those are the politicians of the past. You've got Winston Churchill, JFK, Gandhi, and Nikita Khrushchev. This is what we've got now. Are they worse? Gutierrez definitely is. The era of global boiling has arrived, he says, implying that the Earth's oceans will get to 100 degrees Celsius. But what's really changed, I'll come to in a minute. Here's an artist's impression from the United Nations of the Earth. Here's Keir Starmer, who said 99.9% of women haven't got a penis. First question, how did he do that research? Not to put my reputation, not to put too fine a point on it, he would be a very poor wingman. And Ed Davey, I used to share an office with him. He's stuck between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. Women, quite clearly, can have a penis, says Lib Dem Ed Davey. And these people want to run our health service. Now, I'm not saying these aren't important for the 0.5, 0.6% of people in our society who have transgender issues, but I'm colourblind, and 12.5% of men are colourblind. And that has a practical impact every day on my life because we colour code things and it's a mess. I always wear the same coloured clothes in case I look like an idiot or more of an idiot. Now, all this is a problem because everyone's converging into this double-think, censored speech. I've got a picture of the next Prime Minister, by the way, and it definitely will be this person. Because they think the same, and you're not allowed to think differently. Right, the problem we've got is cancel culture equals totalitarianism, and neither of the two main parties offer an alternative. And as my colleague there so rightly said, we're converging into a very dangerous place. 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. You've probably read 1984 and Animal Farm. This is essentially the cabinet, because they say the opposite things. They do contradictory things. Sadiq Khan's idiotic expansion of the ultra-low emission zone, which won't save lives, but it'll make poor people even poorer. Opposition was silenced to the extent that even though a majority of people freely expressed their opposition in his own consultation, he still went through with it and lost the Uxbridge by-election as a result. But still, he carries on. Now, in response to, I think, what Matt said earlier on, I found this quote. Right, is it all an accident? Yuri Bezmenov KGB defector said, and I quote this, "The first stage is called demoralization, which takes from 15 to 20 years to re-educate one generation of students that is normally exposed to the ideology of its country." In other words, the time it takes to change what the people are thinking. Our fantastic speakers about universities said just about that. Here's one example of the useful idiots. Climate change, 12 years to save Earth. I suggest no to net zero is a classic example where the public said, enough. This is where free speech really comes. This is where free speech becomes limitless because eventually the public boil over. The era of public boiling has arrived because people are sick of this kind of doublethink. From people who fly around the world to tell us not to fly. I talked about that before and I won't repeat it. Operation Earthquake is an example of where free speech is pushing the boundaries back. ICE is internal combustion engine. In short, there's a campaign to say to politicians, if you take our right to drive what we want away, we'll take your right to be a politician away. 4 elements to unlimit free speech. Engage with the public about what it means to be cancelled. Lead reaction to it at citizen level. Politicians have to be influenced by threatening their careers and define and win conversations rationally. This leads me to the answer to the question. We need to have a limitless access to free speech. You've got the right to offend me, because if you haven't, then I can claim everything is offensive, and you cannot say anything. There's one person here who's a victim of the Tavistock Institute. You should talk to her later. She will tell you what it's like to be persecuted, to be forced to say that you're a racist because you have white skin. We need to expose the censors, cancel culture practitioners, climate catastrophists, cover up cons and defame us for self-interest. You'll have seen this in 1984. War is peace. We get that all the time. Slavery is freedom. Don't worry, you don't have to own anything, you'll be happy. Ignorance is strength. Don't worry about it, we'll do it all for you. Find free speech and promote it. TNT Radio is where I am. It's fantastic. The best 2 hours of... Never mind. Next, I think you should say. It's an attempt, a global attempt to regain the agenda to unlimit free speech. To have people who are offensive, who've been cancelled. Lawrence Fox. All the people that even the progressive media here are too scared to employ in case they offend. Because offence is how we limit people. I'll finish with this. Cry Freedom. Steve Biko, one of the greatest films I've ever seen. Says people must not just give in to the hardship of life. They must find a way, even in these environments, to develop hope for themselves, hope for this country. I think that's, although he was talking about the black fight in South Africa and apartheid, that applies to us. And we've got the situation now when it's our duty to take the fight. My answer to the question is, there is no limit to free speech. There is only a limit to our courage to fight for it.
Tom, let's come back to you. Now, you mentioned hate speech. Now, this is one question I was going to ask. Is this concept of hate speech a genuine thing? Or is it just an attempt to shut down free speech? To what extent, do you think?
Well, I think the problem with hate speech is that it's so incredibly subjective. This is why whenever you try to set a boundary for it, it spreads and spreads. I mean, one person's hate speech is another person's deeply held moral conviction. We've seen over the course of the past couple of years how believing in biological sex, believing that there is such a thing as men and women and that certain things and rights and spaces and protections should flow from that, has become tantamount to believing in race science in certain sectors. And it's a perfect example of how the fact, if you can see the principle that there is this thing called hate speech, which is so dangerous, so ugly, so terrible, it needs to be clamped down upon. The question as ever when you're talking about censorship is who decides what hate speech is? Everyone seems to think they know it when they see it, whether they think it's coming from the far right, the far left, the Islamists or whatever. But at the same time, it is ultimately a fundamentally subjective value, which is why we need to junk the idea of hate speech, or at least we need to accept that even if we might consider something to be deeply hateful and bigoted, people have the right to say it. We should make no moral and ethical distinction between censoring a genuine bigot to censoring someone we disagree with. To do so is to make a really profound moral and strategic error, I think. So it's an idea that is impossible to pin down. It is deployed incredibly cynically these days to shut down people they disagree with. We're far beyond this being a kind of neat carve-out that certain well-meaning people are trying to make. It's gone far beyond that. But all the more reason to junk the idea and altogether, I think.
Now, okay, thank you. And another idea that's sort of linked with hate speech is this whole idea of consequence culture, that there's really no such thing as cancel culture, that there's only consequence culture, that you have transgressed, you've crossed the line, you've gone beyond the pale, and therefore, you deserve the opprobrium that is, being heaped down upon your head. And what would your comments be on, this whole idea of, it's not cancel culture, really, it's consequence culture for your bad behaviour?
I think the people who say that are completely full of it, really, because when they say consequence, they mean something very specific. If the consequence of you expressing an opinion is blowback, arguments, a fight verbally, shall we say, great, that's what free speech is all about. No one has any problem with those consequences. When they talk about consequence, they kind of mean it in the same way like a mafia don does. It's like a nice place you've got here, be ashamed if something happened to it. When they say consequence, they mean it in the same way that some of the radical Islamists mean it, which is to say you can say that, but we'll drive you out of this area. This is the sorts of consequence is that they're talking about. This isn't about opening up a debate. This isn't about holding people accountable for what it is that they've said. This is about trying to shut them up. So if that is the consequence that they're talking about, we should have no truck with it. But I think we all know that, as I say, they're being very cynical when they talk about free speech coming with consequences.
Yeah, I think they are. And for me, it's this whole idea of consequence culture is, it's in the same category as so-called hate speech. But you've been tweeting recently about Israel, and people have referred to some of the rather disturbing marches that we've seen on London streets. I mean, to what extent do you think? I mean, people are certainly entitled to be pro-Palestinian. That's beyond dispute. But I mean, to what extent should people be allowed to celebrate and to glorify terrorism? I mean, it's already illegal, isn't it?
It is. I mean, under the 2006 Terrorism Act, you can't encourage or glorify terrorism. At the same time, I think we need to be incredibly careful about thinking, as odious, disgusting, anti-Semitic and all the rest of it as those protests are, I have no problem condemning all of that. I think there's a bit of a danger that we're slipping into the idea that we can just censor this bigotry away. I don't think that we can. I don't think, incidentally, that a lot of the legal restrictions we currently have on freedom of speech are based in sound liberal principles or are actually helpful in that sense. I mean, the problem here is that we're also confronted with the profound hypocrisy and the double standards, which are absolutely galling and I think speak to what a deep problem anti-Semitism is in this country. You've got a police force which, when they're presented with the dictionary definition of woman on a billboard, on a sticker or whatever, will quite happily send their officers out to investigate. That's happened in a couple of cases. Or women can't have penises was one in Liverpool, where actually that sparks a police investigation. Over the weekend, they apparently had about 18 different definitions of jihad to hand as soon as they saw it being chanted at a particular march. So the double standards are absolutely grotesque. And I think it gives credence to that notion that David Baddiel has popularised, the idea that we live under identity politics, but within that Jews don't count. It seems like it's the one identity that, as Eric and Matthew were talking about, isn't sacralised, isn't given that level of protection that it's supposedly afforded all of these minorities.
Because Jews are seen as white.
Well, that's exactly in the pyramid of oppression that has kind of been created. They're somehow seen as the oppressors. But to get back to your original point, I don't think clamping down even on the most extreme and hot-headed protesters is the way to deal with this threat. I think history shows us that. I think it's abundantly clear that the way in which we challenge Islamist extremism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, is through being braver, counter-protest, challenging these people out in the open. I think we could easily fall into a trap where we end up making martyrs out of these people, which we burnish their narrative that we don't really believe in free speech here, that's just a complete myth. And I think we need to see this problem as one that is tackled through more free speech, more counter-speech, not less. And I worry that we're tripping into that area at this point.
There's been some controversy as well about this chant that you hear a lot, and we've heard it for a while: from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Mm-hmm. Now, when the river is the Jordan and the sea is the Mediterranean, I mean, this chant appears to call for the destruction of Israel. I mean, do you think, is that a legal chant, do you think? And the police were saying, well, it depends on the context. Mm-hmm. If you're sort of randomly chanting it, it's okay, but if you're chanting it outside a synagogue, it's not okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have no qualms about saying that when that chant is repeated on the street, it is a call, whether some of the more inexperienced protesters, shall we say, realise it or not, for the ethnic cleansing of Israel, for the killing of Jews. When Hamas in particular talk about from the river to the sea, we know now what they mean by that. I mean, it's become abundantly and horribly clear. All that being said, I don't want the state to be invited to decide what chants mean, when they should be clamped down upon. There's a similar thing around the question of jihad. I understand, and the credulity was again shocking when you had a situation where they said, the Metropolitan Police are saying when this gentleman from Hizb ut-Tahrir and this Islamist extremist organisation uses the phrase jihad in front of an orange banner that talks about Muslim armies, he's obviously just talking about the inner spiritual struggle that all Muslims engage themselves in. That's utterly ridiculous. But do we really want the state or the police to be invited to define what particular concepts, be they religious, philosophical, whatever, mean? We know what these things mean. We should challenge them. And I think in a sense, censorship can be a bit of a cop-out. It's emotionally satisfying. We feel like we've done something about the problem. We've put them behind bars, we've fined them, put them on a tag, whatever it might be. But actually, it kind of stops us from stepping up and taking the responsibility to push back on this horrendous bigotry which has emerged in our midst. And so that's why I think in all of these situations we've got to err on the side of free speech rather than censorship and pluck up that courage ourselves to challenge it.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Lembit, let's give you the last word. And there was a gentleman just down here on the aisle who was... We're only going to take one question because we're badly behind time, but there was a gentleman just here on the aisle who wanted to take a question earlier. But Lembit, just in the light of what we've said and of recent events, do you want to give us another minute or two just to sum up?
Yeah. One of the things that really annoys me, more than annoys me, it really frustrates me, is people mix up Israel with Judaism. Judaism is a faith. Israel is a country. And Benjamin Netanyahu, it doesn't matter what his religion is, you either agree or you disagree with what he's doing. We didn't go around saying, Tony Blair has just had an illegal war in Iraq because he's a Catholic. But we do that about Judaism. And I think we should try a little bit harder to separate what you think about the politics of Israel from the religion of Israel. It's a small point to me, but it's absolutely central, because when we don't do that, we simply encourage anti-Semitism. It's not acceptable to damn Netanyahu or praise him on account of his religion. And in Northern Ireland, I grew up with this, so I really saw the same thing with Catholic and Protestant. Second thing I'll say just about hate speech. Yesterday I was a victim of hate speech. A person called Angelina came to me and said she hated me to my face. She's 6. She's my child. I don't think she should go to prison for that. So how old do you have to be before it is hate speech? Where do you draw the line? What I instead resolved was why she hated me. It's because I hadn't let her do something, draw on the carpet, basically. And then we resolved it. That's actually a microcosm of how life should be. I do get a lot of abuse on and off, and I have done through my life. I accept it. And answer to the interesting question you ask, I will go far beyond even usually what the law would technically allow. I don't mind people being offensive because there's already legislation to stop me being assaulted. And I don't mind you offending me because that's how I learn.
Thank you very much. Please show your appreciation for Tom Slater and Lembit Opik.